I'm Bob del Bonta. I finished my Ph.D. in 1978 at the University of Michigan. I've published a great deal about Jainism over the years. In fact, my first little note was published in 1972 that was on a Jain painting in San Francisco. And since then, I've published about 30 articles on Jain art, mostly on painting, but also on sculpture and architecture. I've written the catalog for this exhibition, The Pursuit of Salvation, Jain Art from India, and been very happy to be able to work with Siddharth Bhansali's collection once more. I'll be having a conversation with Dr. Siddharth K. Bhansali, who is the collector. I've known Dr. Bhansali for over 30 years, and I've known his collection for all of that time. This is the first time we've actually been able to get so much of the Jain collection on display at the same time. A number of the pieces have been in various exhibitions over the years, but we've never had such a wide range of things. And the one thing we've been able to also add to the collection, to the exhibit, are paintings that he bought many years ago. We've tried to bring a wide variety of pieces from his collection to display the whole development of Jain art from the early period, from the 2nd century BC, all the way, well, 2nd century AD, I guess is the earliest piece here, all the way into the 19th century. It's a field that very few people even know, what Jainism is. And so we're trying to introduce the religion to people and also highlight this rather extensive and quite wonderful collection. I'm Bob del Bonta, and I've written the catalog for this exhibit. And this is Dr. Siddharth Bhansali, who is the owner of the material. And so we'll talk a little bit.
Well, great. Shoot.
So Sid, what got you to start buying? Was it, in this case, it's Jain art, of course, and you are Jain.
Right. Well, I've collected things since I was a little baby. It was little sticks and stones as a 2- and 3-year-old, and then moved on to collecting stamps and coins, and then as a teenager I was collecting Art Deco and Art Nouveau, and then it moved into collecting sporting paintings, and then Welsh furniture, and then tribal art. And then early on, I was at an auction in London, and there was a brilliant Akota bronze of a giant seated saint. And very timidly, I bid on the piece, and then I was successful and went home and called my mother in an apologetic tone, said, "Look, I know you probably are not going to like this, but I bought a giant bronze." And I thought all along that I'd be offending my family by collecting material of my faith.
Yes. Yeah.
And her response was, "Well, about time you started collecting something that appeals to me as well." And
But it's also,
and that really opened the floodgates, then there was no holding back. Giant material was available, and it wasn't very popular, so there wasn't much competition in collecting this. It was easy enough to do, and it didn't take very long for the dealers all over the world to find out that there's one guy in New Orleans who's odd enough to be collecting this unpopular material, and so it became very easy.
Yeah.
And I didn't have to, at no time have I gone to look for material. somehow the material finds its way to folks like us that are passionate enough. And so it hasn't been as difficult a process as when I look back now, almost 30 years ago. We were having this conversation with Dr. Pratapaditya Pal, and he was visiting from Los Angeles, and he looked at the material that we had put together here in New Orleans, and he says, you know, this is the first time I'm seeing the depth of Jain material and the wealth of the material, and we've always published about the Hindu art and the Buddhist art, but we should do something about this. And of course, I was quite tickled that we might actually wind up doing something. Yeah. And from there, we worked on putting together this show called the Peaceful Liberators, and that became the mother of all Indian art shows. You know, it was a great show, and we used material literally from all over the world. The Jain material that was as far away as Australia and Japan, and from major museums all over India and Europe and in the United States, and it was a great show. And that was in 93, 94, started in Los Angeles, went to the Kimball Museum, as you know, yes. And then in New Orleans Museum of Art, and then the Queen hosted at the Victoria Albert Museum, and thereafter, I think Jain art was no longer a stepsister of Indian art anymore. Oh, yeah. It's still not mainstream Indian art yet. So, yeah. But at least the vast difference was somewhat neutralized.
Yeah. You have to see enough of it to realize the depth of it all. And this is something I'm trying to do in the catalog. Is, you know, it looks overly simple, since the most common figure you see is the Jina.
That's right.
And like this figure here, and you think, oh well, how many options are there open to the artist? Well, it's surprisingly quite a lot, and it may be a little subtler than, you know, painting things and
sure.
decorating them. But since so much of the material is Digambara, which is the sect that the mendicants wear no clothes, they discard all of their possessions. It's, you know, you'd say, oh, they just all look alike, but I think with finally a show like this, I think this is the first time you've gotten so much of your material, so one can compare, you know, a number of related pieces and realize how rich the art really is.
Right. We had the two important postures of Jain saints. One in the standing saint in the pose of abandonment, referred to as a Kayotsarg pose, and the other of the seated saint. And those were often repeated, but on the other hand, what you will see in the collection is the subsidiary deities and the yakshas and the yakshis, and stylistically, although the standing and the seated Jina is repeated depending on what part of India was being represented and depending on what sect of Jainism was being represented, that gave the artist the liberty to change things up to the degree that they seem to be changed up here.
Well, and the physiognomy can change quite drastically. I mean, you can have a very youthful figure. You can have other figures that are actually very abstract in their forms. And and the thing that I find most compelling about many of the images is that the sort of the ascetic quality of the characters really depicted. I mean, it's very. These are not, you know, they're not moving. They're all in meditation.
Right. The seated jina, and I'm looking at one now, and you see the serenity and the strength in just a seated jina. On the other hand, you see the movement of the yakshi and the liveliness of that image. Therein lies the entire spectrum. Yeah. And of course, the colorful and yet diverse forms of Jain paintings. Yeah. A few years ago, the New Orleans Museum of Art had received a whole collection of Jain manuscripts, and these were mainly 17th and 18th century Jain manuscripts that were very lively and folksy. They'd be classified, I guess, in today's time as naive pictures of folksy paintings. But when you sit and look at them, and I'm sure you've seen them, they're extremely interesting. And
there's also a sophistication about them.
Absolutely. Which is true of folk art and naive pictures all over.
Yeah. The figure of the jina itself is often, in a meditation pose, either in Padmasana, in the lotus position, or the Sarga, standing. And it is interesting that as time goes on and more, well, first you start getting a multiplication of not just a single image. Here we have actually 3 jinas. You have a whole series of different groupings, from 1 to 3 to 4 to 5, to the whole group of 24. And you get a sort of all sorts of layers of new things being added. And there's pieces in the collection that have, flying figures with garlands, and the jina being lustrated by elephants, which goes all the way back to these idea of abhisheka, which is anointing images, and gods get anointed in Hinduism. And kings get anointed when they're made king. So you get all sorts of things added to this simple image of a seated figure in meditation, and he doesn't change.
Right.
That's the beauty. In Buddhism, of course, the Buddha figure does change, because the Buddha figure will have a whole series of mudras, of hand gestures, which will depict various aspects of his history.
Right.
Whereas the jina is always depicted just in dhyana mudra, which it would be a meditation pose. But what's curious is that when you really get to know Jain art, you realize that the meditation is not the meaning there. It's the meaning there is actually his enlightenment. And this is enlightenment that we all are supposed to, well, we should be striving for, at least in a future life, if not the lives that we're living now. But,
right.
So it's when you get into the whole idea of the development of the story of the jina's lives, which all follow the same pattern, you then get to a point where you learn that as a Jain you have to emulate this life. I mean, these jinas are not gods. They're not, like in Buddhism, the Buddha essentially became a god in Mahayana Buddhism. But the jina never gets to that point, because right. Jainism never gets, I mean, it's a completely atheistic sect.
He was the human being that showed us the right path.
Yes.
And one tries to emulate that.
And the beauty, too, is that he comes within a line. And, of course, the Jains believe that there's 24 of these in a line. He's the last of the line. And these groups of 24 actually existed over time multiple times. Because the Jains believe in a cyclic time that goes from perfection to degeneration and then back up. Hindus and Buddhists, of course, don't believe in time working that way. They believe in creation and destruction. But the Jainism, partially because of their belief in ahimsa and nonviolence, they wouldn't ever want to develop a concept of full destruction.
Right.
So, and what's interesting too with the Mahavir is that the last of the line of the 24th of the Jinas, there's fairly good evidence that it wasn't the creator of the religion. He grew up in a certain sect, and Parshvanath, the Parshva, the 23rd, is actually believed to have been a historical figure, and there's some evidence of that.
There was the dates been thrown around were 899 BC for Parshvanath, and was it 599 BC for Mahavir, who lived to be 72 years old, and so he was supposed to have achieved liberation in 520, 527 BC, if my math serves me right. The passion has been for collecting the early material. And the early material, there's a lot more diversity to the form. As time went on, the images, starting about the 13th or 14th century, the images started being a little more staid. They became a little more uniform, and there was not that much diversity of the art form. And so when you look around the room, you will see most of the objects belong to the earlier times when there was a little more artistic liberty, and as a result, the forms are a lot more varied than what you saw much later on. In fact, when you go to the Jain temples and you see the images in present-day worship, the images are quite predictable, especially those the most popular site of Jain worship today is in Western India, and when you visit the temples of the Shvetambar Western Indian Jain worship, you will see the same images again and again and again.
Yes.
Which really was not the case before the 13th century. I think early on we saw...
It's not as true in the South, but I mean that whole Rajasthan, Gujarat, Mount Abu and Jagaya, and in Ranakpur, the marble images are really very much alike.
Right.
And there's a certain
but yet
about
Ranakpur is still fairly early.
Yeah.
Because that's 8th century. When they become somewhat plastic and replicating one another, I think that happened a little later.
Well,
and now it's the convention. Any new images that are made now, they're very predictable, and I would go
Well,
so far as to say that it's almost taboo to have too much abstraction in this art form now.
Well, I really think that would be true of Hindu art too, and Christian art in many ways now. It's very predictable. But then again, the paintings, that extends a lot longer than.
Yeah.
We do have paintings from the earliest paintings in the show are from the early 15th century.
Right.
Extending into the 18th, I guess. And then the 19th century with the Mysore material.
Right.
Which, of course, is close to my heart because I've
mine too, but then everything is close to my heart in this. As a collector, you get...
That's why I know the feeling. My history is very similar to yours.
Right.
I never collected sticks or stones, but I remember there were all sorts of other collections that have fallen by the wayside.
It just evolved into collecting Jain art, and that was the natural thing, but some of the things that...
Well, it was a natural thing, but see, you didn't see it as that. You were concerned about your mother.
Right,
and I could see that, because these are objects that are meant for worship, and are they meant to decorate your home?
I remember growing up as a young boy, sitting around dinner time conversations were always about how wrong it was that our temples were being depleted of objects that were finding their way into collections, and how wrong it was that these great objects from India were just disappearing. And so I knew how important it was for my folks that these things were preserved in the environment that they were. And that too, that sentiment holds true to me too. But on the other hand, the objects in this collection have all been in the West since forever. And so I was able to justify both to myself and to my parents that this was what I was doing was not wrong.
Yes, well, your sister once came to my house and looked at the things I had and, was saying, and I said, well, your brother collect. I said, this stuff has all been here. And the point is that I haven't turned anything into a lamp.
Right.
And that's the thing that's most shocking, is when someone takes an object that was an object of worship and then makes it into some funny, functional.
But after I had acquired that first early Western Indian bronze that dated to the 6th century, and my mother saw it, and actually she saw pictures of it because it was at a sale in London, and then I sent her pictures of it, and she was in India, and I remember the pure joy that she had, and that stimulated this passion even further. But what got you interested in Jain art?
Well, in some ways I fell into it in one sense that my first publication in 1972 was of a Jain piece in the Asian Art collection in San Francisco, Asian Art Museum collection. But ultimately I think it was because I met Saryu many, many years ago, first in the United States, and then the year that I spent in India in 1973, 74, I was in and out of her place in Bombay, and she'd given a lecture in Michigan, this is when I first met her in the States, on some Jain paintings, which interested me because I was very involved. I wrote my dissertation on the Hoysalas, and of course there's a lot of Jain material there too, and there's some Hoysala pieces in the show. But I was really into architecture and sculpture. And Indian painting really didn't interest me, mostly because I didn't really understand it. And so it was really through Saryu that I got more and more interested. And ultimately, the year after I had been in India, I was back at Michigan finishing my dissertation, and Saryu was there teaching, and she did a survey of Indian painting, which was fine, but she also did a graduate seminar that I sat through on Indian painting, mostly the really early stuff, and a lot of the Western Indian style paintings from central India, even though we call it Western India, instead of the Gujarati side. So I really got a good sense of these two very distinct traditions within this early, mostly, 13th, 14th, 15th century. And at the same time, I was still because of the Hoysalas, I was stuck in Mysore, and and there's just so much Jain material there.
Yeah, I see now how you can relate to the South Indian paintings, which are not as popular as the Western Indian paintings,
right? On Shravan Belgola for the 1000th anniversary, I wrote the guide to the site.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
But so that was in 1981.
It's interesting that you mentioned Saryu's name, because early on in my collecting, Saryu and I are very close, and we've been friends, and I took care of her husband. And they would often come and visit New Orleans and look at the Jain material here, and so I really valued her judgment on, although her forte was Jain paintings, and the strength of this collection is the Jain sculpture. But through Saryu, I met many other scholars that really taught me whatever little I know of Jain sculpture, and I'm indebted to them. Actually, it's when you read a little bit and you learn a little bit more about what you have collected that prompts you to go collecting the next piece. And so when you do a little research and learn a little bit about what you have just collected, that's what brings you on to the next.
Yeah.
So although my children refer to me as a hoarder, I think there's a little more of if not really an intellectual, at least a thought process that goes into this style of collecting than merely just accumulating.
Yes, yeah.
The early object that I found in the auction in London, from a distance, it was obviously a Parshvanath. Parshvanath was the 23rd saint of the Jain religion, and he was identified by the 7 snake hoods behind him. But on the other hand, it was clearly Lord Parshvanath from the snake hoods, but the cognizance at the bottom, just below his feet, was that of the second saint, Ajitnath, because there was an elephant rather than a snake. And so that's what made that one sculpture interesting and extremely unusual, and a subject of a lot of discussion among a lot of the scholars we talked about. It just so happened that was one of the early acquisitions. And that led to such animated discussion among so many people that again was partly responsible for stimulating this urge to collect. Again, from our discussion, the two subsidiary deities on either side of a seated or a standing saint would, after I think the middle of the 10th century, each subsidiary deity was the deity that was designated to that saint. But prior to the middle of the 10th century, it was always the universal Yaksha and Yakshi, Ambika and Sarvanubhuti for all the saints, all the 24 saints.
Well, she keeps showing up even later.
She shows up later, thankfully.
Yes. Well, the whole concept of a mother goddess is so important in all of the Indian religions.
It's one of the more interesting stories that when you're told about the story of Ambika, you might want to relate the story of how when there was a knock on the door and someone asking for some food, and Ambika was cooking for some guests, and when there was a knock on the door, she decided to give some of the food to the beggar, which infuriated the mother-in-law. And when the husband came back home, the mother-in-law related to her husband that she'd given away the food to this beggar, and the husband got very angry, and Ambika picked up her two children and ran away from the home with the husband in pursuit. And thereafter follows the stories of Ambika. You know, she runs away and she sits under a mango tree and then falls asleep, and she's able to wake up and feed her children the mangoes, and then in the distance sees her husband coming, pursuing her, and she picks up her children and then jumps into a well. And then when she reincarnates and her husband reincarnates,
he becomes the lion.
He becomes her vehicle. He becomes the lion and her principal disciple. Yeah. So anyway, it's these interesting stories that make some of this sculpture even more interesting.
Well, the stories also, they fall into this whole, they're moralistic stories for Jains, and then saying that you should be giving food to the person who comes and knocks on the door, mother-in-law or not,
Right.
Because there's a lot of this concept of especially giving food to mendicants.
My father's sister was a Jain nun, and to be a Jain, as it's called, sadhvi, she possessed nothing in the world except for a begging bowl, a fly whisk, piece of clothing, a mask, and a staff. Those were her 5 possessions. And for every meal, she went from door to door. Of course, at a particular point in her career as a nun, some of her younger disciples would go out and beg for her and then bring the food to the ashram where she lived, and she would eat once a day. And that is present day Jain clergy tradition, and it hasn't really changed very much over the last 4 or 5 decades that I know of.
Well, more than that.
Right. Well,
and that's the thing, and then one starts to emulate that activity, and so you may fast one day,
right.
You may fast 2, you know, and as time goes on, I mean, many Jains want to reach that point where they give up all of these things. Ultimately, right. They give up eating too. But.
Right, and that's how the Jain clergy eventually move on to the next reincarnation, is that they stop eating. Oh. And the salekhana, as it's called, is starvation till death. It's not a moment of sadness. I mean, it's something really to rejoice. It's because it's a phenomenon of liberation from this cycle, and you're reborn into another life. So, and when you say starvation to death, it sounds a little more morbid than what we see in practice. You know, when my aunt stopped eating, there weren't people forcing her to eat. And she was at peace with herself, and everyone around her was at peace with her. It was, you know, it was not a joyful time because it was obvious that she was going to pass. But on the other hand, it was not such a tragic time either, because she was going to be at peace.
The paintings in the collection are quite varied. Quite a few of them are things that we see behind us, and they're from loose leaf manuscripts that are made, called a poti format. It's in the horizontal format. These are all from Kalpasutra. So the Kalpasutra is a revered text by the Shwetambar sect, believed to have been formulated in the 3rd century BC. And it's an interesting text because it's actually part of the rules that are made for monks during a particular season, which is the Paryanka festival. And this is during the rainy season when monks are, as Sid was mentioning, his aunt would first, she would go and beg for food, and then other people would be begging for her. Younger sadhus would be doing that. During the rainy months, the nuns and the monks have to stay in one place. And it's during that period of time when the Kalpasutra is then read to the laity. And so the rules to the monks are at the very end of the text. And added to that are a series of things. And the main section is known as the Jina Charita, which is the story of the lives of the Jinas. And it's told backwards. So Mahavir, the last of the 24th, his life is told in some detail. And then the artist, the illustrated manuscripts, the artist then, there's a formulaic sort of concept. There's various scenes that are always seen. And if you have a lot of images, illustrations, you have a lot of, other types of things added. But you have Mahavir's story told, and then the 23rd Nemi, and then followed by the 22nd.
22nd.
Yeah, 23rd Parashwa, and then Nemi. And then you have 20 of them that are just named. And I think they give the date of the birth or the star that they were born in or whatever. And there's actually the folio at the top shows 6 of those. And so there was obviously a number of 6s. And then it ends with the story of Rishabha, who is the first of the line. And what's curious is that what's interesting is that there are stories that are told, and there's one up here, stories that are told about the individual jinas that are not in the text. And lots of texts in India get expanded over time, but the Kalpasutra was considered so special that it doesn't get anything added to it. If you find a manuscript that it was read a number of times, often you have commentary that's been written in the margins. I found one manuscript, there were at least 5 different hands for commentary. So it was used quite a lot. I mean, it was read and expounded quite a lot. And so we have these manuscripts that are in, there's a fair number of pages in the show, but there are also some paintings that are merely iconic. Either they were from collections of a painting of each of the 24, or sometimes maybe someone would commission a painting of a particular jina that the family was attached to, often used for worship within the home. And those are these horizontal Kalpasutra pages are mostly from the 14th and 15th century, but the iconic paintings mostly from Rajasthan, and then the ones from Mysore are much later. The Rajasthani things in the show are probably 17th and 18th, and the Mysore material that we have is actually from the 19th. There's a group of texts that are under the umbrella of Samgrahani Sutra, and they're cosmological texts that actually cover quite a lot of territory. They don't just tell stories of the sort of the format of the Jain cosmos, which is very complicated.
Right. And
it's gigantic. I mean, it literally is gigantic. It's bigger than what we think of our universe. Indian religions tend to think in very big numbers. So,
it's interesting. You talked about the Kalpasutra, and it is something that's handled by the clergy. We don't sit and read Kalpasutra manuscripts at home ourselves. So there is a Holy Week for us Jains. It's called Pajushan. It's, as you said, it's towards the end of the monsoons. It's usually in September. And during the Holy Week, we are all, those of us that can, are made to fast. And there is a certain set of rules set aside for that week, because as Jains, strictly speaking, you're not supposed to eat potatoes and onions or garlic, things that grow under the ground. But that is particularly important over Pajushan, where we wouldn't think of eating that, and that's not even brought into our homes over that Holy Week. And my parents, who were able to do this, they would not eat or drink for the whole week. They were able to fast. Of course, I was too much of a wimp to be able to fast for even a whole day. But on the end, through that week, we would go to the temple, especially on the first day and the last day of that week. And it was then that the Kalpasutra was actually opened. It was all tied in a muslin cloth and kept with the clergy. And then in the temple, they would open the Kalpasutra and it be read to us when we would go on that Holy Week. And the other interesting thing, when you look at a couple of the pictures on the wall there, you see that dot right in the middle of the manuscript. The earliest manuscripts were on palm leaf. And the earliest manuscripts had a hole right in the middle, and there'd be a little cord that would tie these manuscripts together
and
so
they
keep them in order. And when they moved on to this paper, they abandoned making the hole right through it, but they kept that little red dot to signify where the hole.
They tried the hole, and then they realized it ripped the paper.
The paper was all falling apart. Right.
Yeah, and the interesting thing, there's one red dot in the center on the recto, and then 3 red dots on the verso. And on the verso is where you have the number of the folio. So even though we don't have a string, if you have a complete manuscript, it takes a little while, but you can actually get it in order. And I was lucky enough to work with a complete manuscript that was well over 100 folios long, and was able to get it, and also had over 100, it was almost 200 folios, and it had over 100 illustrations. And it was the Kalpasutra, and often it would be, they would have another text called a Kalakacharya Katha attached to the end, and this was it now lives in the Nelson Atkins Museum. And it's fabulous when you see it all together, and that's the problem. And Sid was talking about in the early days when you would see things at auction, you'd see one folio. You wouldn't be seeing a whole manuscript. These things are obviously, they're loose leaf. They were very easy to, and the text would just be thrown out or given to some modern artists will then paint over it and pretend that this is a 14th century thing. But you always realize that when they paint over it, it's always covering part of the text, and the text then doesn't make any sense. It's also interesting, and some of the ones that are really decorated they're beautiful, and they're very delicately painted. I mean, if you look at them, for someone who comes to the show, I mean, look at it and just see the quality of the line and the way the hands are drawn. And you can tell that there's some painters that are better than others, and more care is taken. Virtually all of them have gold applied. These are basically they're done for mostly merchant class, but they have a lot of money, and they're really beautiful works of art. And
when you look at these manuscripts and look at a 15th century manuscript that is so perfectly preserved, you understand why that's the case, because these manuscripts were not left out in the open for everyone to look at all year long. It was all folded in this muslin cloth, kept safely away, and it was opened on that one day of the year, and then quickly closed back and kept away till the next year. And so this gold leaf picture was so incredibly well preserved. It looks like it was just painted. And that's the one consistent thing through these pictures, is that in spite of being so early, they're so well preserved.
Well, there's a big tradition that the temples would have a storage for books.
Bhandar.
Yeah. And the Jains revere the printed, well, it's not printed, but the manuscripts quite a lot, because we often talk about Hinduism having this long tradition, an oral tradition before things are written. Well, the Jains did as well, and the big problem there is that it came to a point where they lost their religious texts, and they then had to sort of recreate them. At that point, they turned first to the palm leaves, and then later, once paper came in, and it's because of the palm leaf format, which was horizontal, that the early manuscripts were written. The paper manuscripts were also horizontal.
You know, it's difficult as a collector to point out what is your favorite object.
Oh,
you know,
yeah.
I'm asked that all the time, what is your favorite object? And for me, it's always the earlier and the more primitive that seem like the rarest, and so I would always think that the Kushan and the Gupta material, which was between the 2nd and the 6th century, those, that one hoard of early bronzes, I would imagine those to be my favorite Jain bronzes. Each one of that era, each one was quite unique. Each one, it told a different story from the other one. Even though you would see two Rishabhnath sculptures, they would be so unique.
Well, it's interesting. The Alcota hoard is really interesting for that.
Yes.
And I think it's an early phenomenon that they would have, the artists would, maybe they're vying with each other to be different.
Right.
Because very later on, you can, if you see enough bronze, I've been working with a collection that's in Prescott, Arizona, which is gigantic. And, you know, I'm able to realize that this came from this workshop, and there's a whole series of related images. And it's often the decorative material that's handled all the same way, so you know it's coming from the same place. But the early material, you don't get that sense.
Right.
You know, you do in some of the terracottas, but you don't get that sense in the especially in the bronzes.
Well, the thing about the paper material, although I can appreciate it, the tragedy is that it has to be put away and not enjoyed on a daily basis.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
On the other hand, about 700 of the great bronzes that are in this room, and more of them, of course, are all in my bedroom, and I can enjoy them on a daily basis. They don't have to be put away in cupboards, and they can have light shone on them without hurting them.
Well, Indian paintings are pretty hardy, but I mean, I do have paintings in my house that have cloth over the frame.
Yeah.
So.
Well,
I have a couple of dark ones.
Early on, when Saryu would come and visit, I used to have pictures up, and of course, I was criticized for having the pictures up to be. She said, look, I mean, you'll be able to enjoy these pictures for a while, but sooner or later they're going to fade.
Yeah, so Saryu came to dinner once at my house, and I had put some stuff specifically up for when she was there, and the Sidhus were coming the same night. And I pointed out that these things aren't up. You know, there were other photographs or something were in this frame, so I was not criticized.